A fake HOA enforcer tried to tow a state-licensed ambulance right out of paramedic Ben Turner's driveway. Armed with a phony badge and unchecked arrogance, Chuck Probst thought no one could stop him. But Ben had a signed letter from the governor himself, and backup was already on the way. Just wait until you hear how this showdown ended, and why justice, in the end, prevailed. It was the kind of morning where everything should have gone smoothly. By 8 a.m., the sun was already baking the streets of Foxwood Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. The temperature was climbing fast, over 90 degrees and rising. Ben Turner wiped the sweat from his brow as he double-checked the inventory inside his critical care ambulance van, parked in the short driveway of his rented home. This wasn't an ordinary vehicle, and Ben wasn't an ordinary paramedic. He ran a nonprofit called Mobile Life, providing free emergency transport for patients in the state's most underserved rural counties, folks too isolated or too poor to reach hospitals quickly. His Ford Transit had been transformed into a mobile ICU, custom power systems, refrigeration for sensitive medications, satellite radio links for rural comms, and a ventilator setup worth more than some homes. All of it operated under a special state license, personally approved by the governor's office after Mobile Life won a public service award the year prior. Ben took pride in what that van stood for, and today he had a community event lined up, health screenings and transport services out in Warren County. But just as he secured the last piece of equipment, the knock came. Urgent. Rapid. Ben opened the door to find his neighbor, Samantha Hale, breathless. "Ben, you've got to come now. He's towing your ambulance." Ben's heart stopped. Without a word, he sprinted down the front steps, rounding the hedges just in time to see a scene that shouldn't have been possible. A burly tow truck sat parked sideways across the narrow street. The front wheels of his ambulance were lifted clear off the ground, held by thick metal hooks and hydraulic arms. Standing beside the driver's door, clipboard in hand, was Chuck Probst. Ben recognized him instantly. Chuck had been swaggering through the neighborhood all week, wearing tactical pants and a bulky utility vest, with a fake-looking badge clipped to his belt. His black Jeep bore oversized magnetic decals, HOA Enforcement Unit. Word had spread that Chuck was running a private patrol, hired by the HOA board for their annual compliance sweep. Until this moment, Ben had ignored it. Now, watching a man with zero medical training tamper with his ambulance, his blood ran cold. "You can't tow that," Ben shouted, racing toward him. "That's a state-licensed medical transport." Chuck barely glanced at him. "It's a commercial vehicle," he said coolly. "Violates community parking restrictions." Ben's voice sharpened. "Look at the windshield. That permit exempts this van under North Carolina state law. It's not just parked here. It's in service." Chuck smirked, flipping a page on his clipboard. "I see it. Looks fake to me. Doesn't matter. Tow's ordered. Pay your fine if you want it back." By now, a few neighbors had begun gathering, drawn by the noise and sheer absurdity of what they were witnessing. Phones came out. People whispered. Ben's hands shook as adrenaline surged through his veins. He couldn't risk his equipment being dragged away, or worse, damaged beyond use. He yanked out his phone and dialed 911. Chuck chuckled under his breath. "Go ahead. Sheriff's Department doesn't enforce HOA rules." The arrogance in his tone cut through Ben like a knife. Without another glance, Chuck turned and walked down the block, heading toward another vehicle he'd marked for towing. Behind him, the tow operator adjusted the chains, seemingly unsure, yet not willing to disobey Chuck's order. The crowd murmured louder. Someone gasped, "He's really going to tow an ambulance?" At that moment, shock rippled through the onlookers. It wasn't just wrong, it was almost unthinkable. Ben took a deep breath and steadied himself. He had one card left to play, but first, he needed reinforcements. He wouldn't let this stand. Ben stood frozen, watching as the tow operator climbed back into the truck's cab. The chains were locked, the front wheels of the ambulance still in the air. Inside that van were life-saving monitors, refrigerated medications, and ventilators calibrated for fragile patients. Moving the vehicle without properly disarming its systems could cause thousands in damage, or worse, render the equipment unusable for the patients who depended on it. Ben forced himself to step forward, waving both hands. "Wait, please. You can't move it like this. The systems inside aren't powered down. You could ruin everything." The driver hesitated, his hand on the gear lever. Ben pressed on, voice tight with urgency. "This is an emergency transport vehicle. It operates under state protection. You don't want to be responsible for damaging critical equipment." For a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in the driver's eyes. He looked back toward Chuck Probst, who was standing farther up the street, clipboard still in hand and radiating smug authority. The driver let out a tense sigh. "Buddy, he's got an HOA order, not my problem." He shrugged, as if trying to absolve himself of the responsibility that weighed heavier by the second. Ben's chest burned with rage. This wasn't about a parking rule anymore. It was about Chuck flexing power he didn't even possess at the expense of an ambulance that could save lives. More neighbors were arriving now, phones out, capturing every angle of the unfolding scene. Voices rang through the summer air. "Is this even legal? How can they touch an ambulance?" Samantha Hale, standing a few feet from Ben, kept shaking her head in disbelief. "How is this happening? How can he just tow a state ambulance?" Ben swallowed hard, mind racing. He had to do more than argue. He had to prove that Chuck's so-called authority was a sham. Pulling out his phone, Ben searched the name he'd seen on Chuck's badge, HOA Enforcement Unit, Triangle Division. In seconds, the truth became clear. Chuck's company was a private security firm, not connected to any government agency, not law enforcement, not county code enforcement, not even licensed tow authority. Chuck Probst was a contractor hired by the HOA board to issue notices, nothing more. But standing there with a badge and barking orders, he'd created an illusion of power that most residents weren't equipped to challenge. Ben's pulse pounded in his ears. He needed something stronger than an online fact check. He needed the highest possible authority. Inside the house, he hurried to the small home office where his mobile life paperwork was stored. There, in a locked safe, was an envelope he had always kept for emergencies, a signed letter from Governor Dana Cooper, declaring that mobile life vehicles were recognized as essential services, protected from interference by any local body, HOA, or private contractor under state emergency operations law. Ben's hands trembled slightly as he retrieved the letter. This wasn't a piece of paper. It was a shield, one he hoped would force Chuck to back down. By the time he returned outside, the atmosphere had shifted. The tow operator had stopped mid-process, clearly unnerved by the growing number of phones filming him. Several neighbors were loudly questioning Chuck's authority. The driver had lowered the van's wheels back to the ground, though the chains still held it fast, as if waiting for permission to release it fully. Chuck noticed Ben approaching, envelope in hand, and strode up with an exaggerated swagger. "What's that? Your little letter? Not going to change HOA rules?" Ben didn't speak. He simply opened the envelope and unfolded the letter for all to see. The bold signature of Governor Dana Cooper glistened in the sunlight. The language was unambiguous. Mobile life transport vehicles are designated as essential emergency equipment under the North Carolina Emergency Services Act. All local, municipal, and private entities are required to recognize and protect the operational integrity of these vehicles, exempting them from parking or enforcement actions of any kind. For the first time that morning, Chuck's smug expression cracked. His eyes darted over the page. The cameras caught the moment, his flush of discomfort, but almost instantly he straightened. "That letter doesn't scare me," he said with a forced laugh. "Around here, I enforce the rules." That one sentence, drenched in arrogance, lit a spark in the crowd. The neighbors' murmur grew sharper, louder. Words like fraud, illegal, and call the real police flew through the air. Phones angled upward to capture every word from Chuck. What had started as a compliance sweep had now become a public confrontation, and Chuck was no longer in control of the narrative. Ben stood his ground, fists clenched at his sides. He'd shown the law, Chuck had chosen to ignore it. Now, Ben knew. It was time to escalate this beyond a neighborhood argument. Enough was enough. Ben's pulse thundered in his ears. Chuck had seen the governor's letter and mocked it in front of the whole neighborhood. Worse, the tow truck was still rigged to his ambulance, and the equipment inside remained vulnerable. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a deliberate challenge to state law. Ben slipped back inside for a moment, hands steady now, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He no longer called 911. This required someone higher. Flipping to his emergency contact list, he dialed a private line he had only used once before. Major Calvin Willis, Director of Operations at the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Major Willis had long been a supporter of mobile life. He'd even helped secure the statewide exemption for their vehicles. If anyone could break through this HOA charade, it was him. The line clicked. Willis? Major, it's Ben Turner. I'm on site. HOA contractor is trying to tow my ambulance. I've got the governor's letter in hand. He won't stand down. There was a beat of silence. Then Willis's voice dropped into a clipped, commanding tone. Understood. Hold him there. Deputies are being dispatched. I'm calling the sheriff and the state attorney general now, huh? Ben exhaled. Finally, real backup was on the way. Outside, Chuck continued striding between residents, arguing loudly and waving his clipboard. He wore his phony badge like armor, ignoring the rising tide of voices pushing back against him. HOA has the right to enforce community standards, he insisted. This is a commercial vehicle parked in violation. Ben stood silently nearby, phone still in hand, recording every word. Samantha whispered beside him, Do you think they'll really come? Ben nodded. They're coming. And 15 tense minutes later, they arrived. 2 unmarked SUVs rolled to a stop at the curb. The doors opened, and out stepped 3 uniformed sheriff's deputies, followed by a sharp-suited assistant state attorney. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Phones lifted higher, voices hushed in anticipation. Ben felt a surge of righteous anger burn through him as the deputies approached Chuck directly. The lead deputy's voice rang clear and firm. Sir, you're in violation of multiple state statutes. This vehicle is exempt from HOA enforcement. Chuck's confident posture wavered, but in an act of stubborn bravado, he yanked the badge off his belt and held it out. I'm acting under HOA authority. This is official business. The deputy didn't flinch. With a swift motion, he snatched the badge from Chuck's hand and examined it. Impersonating law enforcement is a felony in this county. A visible ripple of approval swept through the watching neighbors. Several gasped softly. The assistant state attorney produced a printed copy of the relevant statutes and read aloud for the crowd's benefit. HOA agents may issue written notices of noncompliance. They have no power to detain vehicles, to tow vehicles without court orders, or to interfere with state-protected emergency equipment under the Emergency Services Act. Chuck tried to protest again, his voice thinner now, the earlier bravado drained. But the deputy had already signaled to his colleagues. Ben watched, fists clenched in righteous fury, as Chuck was calmly and methodically placed in cuffs, right there in front of the ambulance he'd tried to claim. Charges include impersonating an officer, attempted illegal seizure of protected infrastructure, and violation of state emergency transport protections, the deputy announced. It was a moment of pure vindication. As Chuck was led towards the unmarked SUV, the crowd could no longer contain itself. Applause broke out. "That's what you get!" someone shouted. Ben didn't join the cheering. He simply stood tall, recording the entire scene, heart pounding with satisfaction. He hadn't just defended his ambulance. He had defended the mission and the rights of every vulnerable patient who depended on mobile life. And Chuck's smug reign of intimidation had finally come to an end. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within hours of Chuck's arrest, news of the incident spread well beyond the neighborhood. Video clips shot by residents made their way to local media outlets, and by evening the story was being discussed on regional news. Private HOA enforcer arrested for targeting state-licensed ambulance. The sheriff's department confirmed the charges: impersonating a law enforcement officer, attempted illegal seizure of protected infrastructure, and violating the Emergency Services Act. It turned out Chuck's HOA enforcement unit wasn't properly licensed for any kind of enforcement activity. In fact, his so-called credentials had been rejected in neighboring counties after prior complaints. By week's end, under pressure from state regulators and public outrage, Chuck's company was formally dissolved. As for the Foxwood Estates HOA board, they faced their own reckoning. Once the videos reached the broader community, the board was hit with an avalanche of criticism, not just from residents, but from state officials and the public at large. An emergency meeting was called. The board issued a formal public apology to Ben Turner and the Mobile Life program. Their statement read in part, "We regret the actions taken by a contractor acting beyond the scope of their authority. We deeply apologize to Mr. Turner and the Mobile Life organization, whose mission we fully support." The apology, while necessary, wasn't enough to quell the outrage. Facing mounting pressure and calls for accountability, the HOA president, who had hired Chuck without proper vetting, resigned. A new interim board was appointed, with a clear mandate to restore trust in the community. Meanwhile, at the state level, action was swift and decisive. The governor's office issued a public commendation for Ben's conduct, praising him for upholding the mission of Mobile Life under extreme provocation. Major Willis personally called Ben the following Monday. "We've made it official," he said. "From now on, all Mobile Life vehicles across North Carolina are permanently protected. No HOA, private entity, or municipal agency may interfere with your operations again, not without a direct order from the state attorney general." Ben exhaled a long breath of relief. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a win for every patient who relied on the service. His ambulance, released immediately after the deputies intervened, was back in full service within the hour. All systems checked out. Nothing had been damaged. That evening, as the neighborhood buzzed with talk of what had transpired, Samantha Hale stopped by his porch with a smile. "So, after all this, are you thinking about moving out of this place?" Ben chuckled softly and shook his head. "No way," he said with a grin. "Someone's got to keep these folks honest." The final image that lingered in everyone's minds, captured in countless videos, was impossible to forget. Chuck Probst, red-faced and in cuffs, being walked past the very ambulance he had tried to tow away, while Ben Turner stood tall, calmly holding the governor's letter for all to see. It was the perfect moment of poetic justice, a reminder that real authority comes not from a badge you buy online, but from the law that protects those who serve. Satisfaction was sweet. Justice had prevailed, and the fake cop had been finally exposed.